Okay, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our event this afternoon. My name is Mark Williams. I'm the acting director of the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs, and welcome to everyone to this afternoon's talk, which has multiple sponsors. This event is being sponsored by the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs. It's being sponsored by the Center for Careers and Internships, as well as the M² Program Committee, the Political Science Department, and the Middle East Studies Program. And I'm delighted to have as our guest this afternoon Dr. Amy Smithson. Dr. Smithson is a senior fellow at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies in Washington, D.C., a place that some of us on campus have heard about, Monterey. And she holds degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, from Georgetown University, as well as George Washington University. Her areas of interest and expertise center around chemical weapons and biological weapons proliferation, as well as threat reduction mechanisms. Besides working at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, she's also held other positions at other centers. She's worked for the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Henry L. Stimson Center. She currently chairs the Global Affairs Council on Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Weapons for the World Economic Forum. One of the reasons I'm particularly delighted that she was able to squeeze Middlebury into her schedule is that she is a go-to person for the media. She is often, her views and her opinions and her analysis are often sought by media outlets, as well as Congress and various congressional committees. In the course of her career, she's authored or co-authored or edited or co-edited a number of books and journal articles and book chapters. Her latest book, published by Stanford University Press, is titled Germ Gambits: The Bioweapons Dilemma, Iraq, and Beyond. That was published by Stanford in 2011. Now this evening she's going to talk to us about this topic here, chemical weapons in Syria, something that's actually in the news a great deal. Even today there are reports about Syria in the news. The bumpy road to elimination. And so for the next 40 or 45 minutes, Amy, the time is yours. Thank you.
And what I'd like to do this evening is get us all on the same playing field with regard to the program, the chemical weapons program in Syria, where it came from, and some of the main events that have transpired over the last several months, as well, and then kind of take a pause and give you some thoughts about why different players in this are doing certain things, and then set you up with some thoughts and facts about what might unfold in the months ahead. So with that as a marching order, let's start with an overview of Syria's chemical weapons program. You've no doubt read a number of things that the U.S. government has said about this program in recent weeks. But often you don't get the full picture, and I think the full picture is important to have an understanding of. Syria's program started a few decades ago and was initially reliant on other countries. In fact, if you read U.S. intelligence assessments a while back, they would say that they actually inherited some weapons, mustard gas, from Egypt. But in the early part of this program, they were also getting assistance from the Soviet Union as well as Czechoslovakia. Now, in the 1990s, the assistance mostly came from Russia, and that's why I have that lovely mug shot in the middle. That gentleman I had the misfortune to meet, his name is Anatoly Kontsevich. And at one point, he had a very high rank in not only the military sector of the Russian chemical weapons program, but also the civilian sector. Because right after the Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Yeltsin appointed him as the guy to be in charge of overseeing the downsizing, if not elimination, of the Soviet biological weapons program, which Russia inherited, but as well as overseeing the destruction of Russia's chemical arsenal, which they declared at a nice round neat number of 40,000 metric tons. Now, I've met my fair share of chemical and biological weaponeers, Soviet ones, American ones, Canadian ones, British ones, Iraqi ones. This guy, when I shook his hand, my hand almost slipped out. A more unctuous, unpleasant individual you could never hope to meet. And the reason you see the book title at the top, that's Bill Mirzianov. He blew the whistle on a super secret Soviet chemical weapons program that Western intelligence didn't know anything about, the Novichok program. And he was in the Soviet chemical weapons program for the better part of 26 years before he did that. And the reason he did that is because at the time, Gorbachev was publicly stating Moscow was no longer making chemical weapons. He knew this not to be true. He also knew them to have made an entirely new generation of nerve agents, more lethal than VX, sarin, so man, the whole lot. And according to Bill Mirzianov, who was a witness to these events, that man decided to make some fast money when things were really fast and loose right after the Soviet Union crumbled. And so he sent a few train loads full of precursor chemicals, some equipment, and some technical research and development assistance down to Syria to make a buck. That is probably what enabled the Syrian chemical weapons program to become capable of making this stuff on their own instead of being so heavily reliant on outside and foreign assistance. And that is also probably what influenced the Syrian approach to the manufacture of nerve agents. I'm going to use some technical jargon here. My apologies. You've probably heard the term binary chemical weapon. You know what it means? All right. Let's start with the old-fashioned way. Unitary chemical warfare agent means it's already mixed. It's either sitting in a bulk container or maybe in a munition. That's exactly what I expect to find of any mustard gas that Syria may have. With their nerve agent program, they took a more modern approach, and this is probably what they learned because of the Kontsevich assistance. That is something actually that the United States originated in an effort to make this nasty business more safe. Instead of having it sitting already mixed, and these are very highly corrosive chemicals, and when you sit them in metal, they tend to end up leaking, not a good thing. You take the final two chemicals that are used to make the nerve agent and store them separately, either in containers and then put them into a mixer and do the mixing right before you fill them into a weapon, or in the case of the United States, we had a more sophisticated approach. We actually put them inside a weapon with a thin membrane separating the final two chemicals, and after the bomb was dropped, boom, the membrane was burst. The mixing literally took place on the way to the target, and there you have some sarin. So this traces through in other aspects of what I'll tell you about what's happened in the last couple of months. They've also had some help from Iran. Not entirely surprising there, given what you understand of the political allegiances between Syria and Iran. But there they've gotten precursors and technical assistance too. The Iranians certainly know a great deal about making chemical weapons. They had a chemical weapons program. And they've gotten delivery system assistance from North Korea and Russia. So essentially the estimate of the program was they've got mustard, sarin, VX, cyanide. In fact, Bashar al-Assad's father used cyanide to quell opposition during the 1980s. Keep that one in mind. And that they have a variety of different ways to deliver this, whether it's missiles or bombs or rockets. In other words, they've got a full-up program. So that's what we knew about it before this really started to grab people's attention at this point in the game. There were a series of incidents that took place in Syria. beginning late last year, attacks chemical events in Homs, Aleppo, and in Damascus. And the ones that took place on the 19th of March this year were really the ones that tended to rattle people. And as a person who was watching this from an ocean away, looking very closely at the reports, not only of eyewitnesses, but of what reporters and other media were saying, I was having a difficult time figuring out what was going on. Because, look, if you're, heaven forbid, downtown Middlebury and chemicals go in the air, it's not like you're going to be able to walk up to a reporter a few hours later, if you survive it, and say, that was sarin. Eyewitnesses don't tend to be able to make that type of a statement. You actually have to have chemical analysis to determine what's in the air. So what we knew at that time were people were dropping dead and being injured by some type of hazardous chemical, and there happened to be a lot of commercial chemicals that can cause the same types of symptoms that were being reported in the victims. Pinpoint, dilated pupils and vision problems, choking, coughing, barfing, the gamut, okay? This type of thing, again, a lot of commercial chemicals will cause that. Don't go playing with pesticides. Just don't. That's how they discovered nerve agents, by the way. They were looking for a better way to kill cockroaches. So at this point in the game, I'm looking at three possibilities as to what's happening with these chemical incidents. We know that Syria has a chemical weapons program. Was he testing the waters? Was he trying to see whether or not the international community would react and become involved in the civil war on the side of the rebels if he pulled out yet another despicable weapon in this civil war? I didn't know. I didn't have any concrete evidence at that point. Were the rebels, who are fully aware that the Syrian government is believed to have a chemical weapons program, putting something out in the air in order to point the finger of suspicion at the Assad government? If you're desperate enough to get assistance, you might consider doing that. So that was my second school of thought. And the third school of thought for me was something that has actually happened frequently in other conflicts. It happened during the Yugoslavian conflict. In almost every other one, a conventional bomb lands next to a plant or even a university laboratory that's got a tank of chemicals. A valve ruptures, a line breaks, and all of a sudden you've got bad stuff in the air. Could this have been collateral damage? I couldn't say. That all changed on August the 21st. There were, I don't know how y'all wake up, but usually, you know, if I've been working pretty hard, I'll set an alarm and then click on the morning news and kind of lay there in bed for a few minutes. That's what I did on the morning of the 21st. About a minute into the Today Show, Richard Engler is live on the air, and he's saying, widespread chemical weapons attack, blah, 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 hundreds dead, blah, blah. And I'm like, whoo, straight up in bed and going, this is not good. Immediately after that, I started pulling down videos. And there's a video right here that was the one that convinced me beyond the shadow of a doubt that this wasn't fake. Because the initial inquiries that I got from the media was, is this real? Could they have staged this? Surely this can't be real. And that video of that little boy, who's probably 5 or 6, convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was not something that was staged. Because he is twitching at different rates with both hands and both eyes in his mouth. You know, there are some that have appeared on nightly newscasts a lot during those early days where adults are showing symptoms, screaming and, you know, shaking and stuff like that. You can maybe coach an adult to do something like that, but you can't coach a kid to do that. And they zoom in very close on his face, and the camera's there for 2 minutes. So I knew right away it wasn't fake. It was probably in the organophosphorus chemical family, same family as nerve agents and pesticides, fertilizers. And then I looked at the timing of the attack, and that's the other video that really came in handy. It was up by the New York Times fairly early. It actually shows You can see and hear the detonations involved with this attack. It must have been taken from a downtown Damascus hotel. And you can see that it is a concerted attack before you even get eyewitness reports that are coherent about how many neighborhoods and how fast these rockets were falling. And it was the hour of the attack that really did it for me. If you are a military that is trained in chemical warfare doctrine, that's exactly the time you would choose to do this type of thing, if you want it to be an effective attack. Because when the winds are cool, or down, the lowest, that's at the wee hours of the morning, and when the temperatures are coolest, that's exactly what makes poison gas want to hang where you put it. So that night on the NewsHour, I'm basically saying it was Assad. And you can look again, these are things that came out not necessarily publicly, they were reported, but I was also seeing these images, some fine analysis by Ted Postal of MIT. The New York Times reported it. I happened to get my hands on it. But when I looked at his analysis about the quantity of agent involved in the delivery systems, it confirmed my initial suspicions. But this is what should really make the case. And are there any scientists, like hard scientists? Hey, I'm a political scientist, so I'm not casting aspersions, but do we have any chemists and life scientists in the room? This is exactly why we need you in this field. This is the report that was released by the Secretary General on the 16th of September about the attacks. And to me, this is the equivalent of the gun, the fingerprint, and the bullet. It completely points toward the Assad government. And it's not just because at that time the rebels didn't have much of any rocket capability, maybe some do-it-yourself bombs, or this quantity of chemicals, but they certainly weren't coordinated enough. I mean, there are lots of different groups fighting in there. To pull off an orchestrated attack like this at the same time against so many different locations, and the idea that they would attack their own in bed just doesn't really make a lot of sense. But what I've done is pull a few charts from this report, just to give you a snapshot. There are so many positives in here for sarin, and if it's not positive for sarin, it's positive for the degradation byproducts of sarin, meaning the chemicals it breaks down into after it's released, or the stabilizers used to make sarin in the environmental samples. There are people 5 days after the attack, when the inspectors were finally let out of the hotel, that are showing very clear and pronounced symptoms of sarin exposure. And the medical analysis is all down the same line. In other words, the running of the blood samples, all down the same line. The guys in the bottom picture shaking hands, both colleagues and friends of mine. The one on the right-hand side runs the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. They're the Chemical Weapons Convention inspectors. That's a Zoom shoe. And the other guy, you may not have seen his face, but he's the guy behind this report, and I met him back when I was doing research for Jerome Cambett's. He was fire tested long before he ever ended up in a Damascus hotel, because he was a chief inspector for the United Nations Special Commission, and Tariq Aziz once blessed him out, so he's not going to be intimidated. But he had the ideal technical credentials to go into this situation because he used to run Sweden's Chemical and Biological Defense Facility. That's Åke Sällström. And Åke gave us one other gift in this report, which also mentions things like the directions that the shells came from. These happen to be areas where only the government forces were occupying, and the meteorological conditions, blah, 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 these things I was talking about earlier that even a political scientist can see. He gave us the smoking gun leading back to Moscow. That's Cyrillic writing on one of the delivery systems. I think we might see more of this in the days ahead if the OPCW breaks some of its policies. But this was, I think, one of those hallmark events in this series of very rapidly moving developments. I've been working chemical weapons convention stuff since the early 1990s and a little bit before that. I've never seen anything move this fast. The Chemical Weapons Convention took 24 years to negotiate. This is a world where things move slowly. Not in this particular set of circumstances. So, what did Syria declare? Well, they declared 23 sites with 43 facilities. You can have a larger location with specific areas within that location. That's the difference between those two. 18 of those were production facilities that are in situ. That's the way this stuff is usually done. One of the things that really caught my attention about the Syrian declaration was they put it on wheels. They declared 8 mobile mixing and filling units. I know of no other chemical weapons program, I may be missing some data, that has ever put it on wheels. That also tells you something when you start connecting the dots about the seriousness of Bashar al-Assad's attempt to wage war in the midst of a civil war, to wage chemical warfare. Because he was worried about having his supply lines cut off to his fixed production facilities. He put it on wheels. A few storage facilities, etc., also declared. They declared 1,000 metric tons of bulk chemical warfare agent and precursor chemicals, the last few chemicals that go into making the agent. Think that binary approach, and you'll get the picture. Why do I have clouds over these two parts of the declaration? Because, well, when the bilateral framework was announced in Geneva, in the press backgrounding briefing, Secretary of State Kerry said on the record, we think they have 45 sites. What do you know? They declare 43. There have been unnamed U.S. officials who had flapped their lips in the press in the early days of this, giving a general description of what the United States believed Syria's chemical warfare program to consist of. That figure, 1,000 metric tons, you'll find it a lot. I've got clouds over that because if you're taking any play out of the Saddam Hussein playbook, you're going to declare what the West thinks you have. Not more, even if you've got it. So automatically, I've got a question mark hanging over those two things. One of the things that has been misreported by a great many major media outlets because they haven't had the time or the pleasure of reading the specific details of the verification annex of the Chemical Weapons Convention is this next part of the declaration. The 290 metric tons, which are most often in public in the last few days described as filled chemical weapons. Nope. It's more precursor chemicals. It's just a different type of precursor chemicals. I've spoken with The Hague about this. Syria has not declared any chemical weapons. Filled. We'll come back to that in a minute. They did, however, declare a number of unfilled munitions, which one would expect if you had a chemical weapons program. So, what's been happening since before Syria became a full member of the treaty? Syria acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention the very day that the bilateral framework was announced. Interesting, huh? This letter goes into Ban Ki-moon and they say, sign us up. And the treaty did not enter into force for them until the 14th day of October. But before that, they sent in the first advanced group of inspectors. Mostly what they were doing were talking about the logistics, the security, where the inspectors would stay. Some details about what Syria declared early on before it submitted this final declaration on the 27th that was supposed to be the full story about its chemical weapons program. Well, what they were doing was disabling production facilities, and I've given you a few pictures to give you an idea of what goes on when you go in to smash and torch and bulldoze And that's exactly what they've been doing. It's called functional disabling of production reactors, mixers, and the filling equipment. In fact, wasn't it interesting? With one of the early site visits, Assad sent the state TV in to accompany the inspectors. If you want to get the word out to the world that you're cooperating, maybe to lull them into confidence that you're really intent on doing this, you're going to send media in with the inspectors. That just doesn't happen very often. In fact, as far as I know, I don't know of any other government that has ever allowed a television crew in to witness an inspection of a military facility. So, methinks he protests a lot. He's trying to convince us he's cooperating. But they've done it. They've met one of the early deadlines. They were supposed to finish disabling the production facilities by the 1st of November. But that's the easy part of this, in all candor. So here's where we are. They have inspected almost all of the sites. There are only 2 that have not been inspected at this point. 2 of the ones declared. We don't know what they haven't declared. And the Syrians have declared the 2 sites that the inspectors haven't visited as abandoned sites where they had moved the items that were located there to sites where the inspectors have been. Once again, it's all nice and neat and tying up like a Christmas present, isn't it? They've also managed to destroy at least 154 warheads. My understanding is that these are actually some of the toughest warheads ever attempted to be destroyed. Usually you can just buzzsaw these things or roll a bulldozer over them. These are, for some reason, very resilient. The next major deadline, everybody is catching their breath right now because this was a real push to get to this many sites under these circumstances, is that the governing body of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons will decide on the 15th of November whether or not to approve the plan for destruction of the rest of this that Syria submitted just a few days ago. And what's going to happen after that? Well, now's when it really gets more than its fair share of interesting. Because what's located at a variety of sites around Syria that has been declared is probably going to end up being transported toward the coast. One thing to try to go in and inspect something in an area where the Syrian government kind of has control. It's another thing to take this type of material, which may have safety problems to begin with, depending upon how it's stored. Think of those rail cars that you see rolling by that have chemical markings. Could be in something that big. It could be in barrels. You've also seen a few pictures that, again, courtesy of Syrian State TV, where you can see some of the type of containers that things might be located in. Tough business to move this through a civil war because there are any number of players that might consider this to be an attractive target. Hamas, Hezbollah, al-Qaeda are in this fight. The Russians, by the way, came into Geneva wanting to destroy whatever had to be destroyed along the coastline. The U.S. game plan from the get-go was get it out of there. Get it out of Syria. And that's what looks to be the Syrian destruction proposal. That the United States pressed Russia, Russia pressed Syria, because initially the Syrians weren't thinking about moving anything. So then it comes to, where are they going to do this? Now, you've probably seen some news reports. Norway got outed. That's a tough position to put a friend in. The Norwegian minister was kind of compelled to make a public statement about, yes, we're considering doing this, but it's easier to consider this behind closed doors, not out in the public, in the glare of publicity, because these are materials that pretty much no one wants coming to their shores. I know that the United States and Russia have absolutely no interest in having this come to our territory for destruction. So we both have great big destruction programs that are now winding down, and there's a lot of politics behind not in my backyard that come into play in the U.S. and Russian decisions in this regard. So there were a couple of other countries. The French supposedly said something. So did a couple of others. But I think the cheese left standing here is going to be Albania. Albania, you say? Albania actually had its own little chemical weapons problem a while back. For those who are actually going back and doing their homework here, they inherited some chemical weapons from the Chinese. Go figure that. And the Albanians pretty much know nothing about destroying chemical weapons. So why the Albanians? The Germans, Swiss, and Americans came in and destroyed the Albanian stocks. It's an interesting story in and of itself. But the Albanians are described to me by a U.S. official as really, really liking us and pretty much willing to cooperate as long as we make it worth their while. So that looks like where this may land, but there's a lot that has to transpire between now and then. Let's take a minute and think about why is who doing what here, okay? First of all, I don't rule out the possibility that Bashar al-Assad's just a jackass who got painted into a corner. That's why you see that little picture there. But, pardon my candor, but the guy has waged an atrocious war. The despot apple has not fallen far from the tree here. His father also did atrocious things with chemical weapons and was ruthless in every attempt he needed to make to retain power. So his inspiration could be Daddy Dearest. Then there's always the guy next door. At least he used to be next door. Saddam Hussein, we'll talk about him a little bit more. He certainly went to extensive lengths to keep everything he had, nuclear, biological, and as much chemical as he could. His game plan from the outset was to forfeit his chemical weapons program because the world knew about it. He held back his VX. Then there's that other Middle East strongman, now no longer with us, Muammar Gaddafi. He also forfeited his weapons of mass destruction program and joined the Chemical Weapons Convention and made supposedly a full, final, and complete declaration there too. Stay tuned on that. So those could be his inspirations. But in recent weeks, because things have appeared to be going so well, I think the conventional wisdom is he's gunning for a docket in The Hague. When the UN Secretary General has used international war criminal and your name in the same sentence, you might well better learn to read the tea leaves on the wall or the handwriting on the wall. So that's the International Criminal Court. It's hard to say whether or not that's what he's gunning for at this stage, because we're not dealing with a rational man. August 21st proved that to me beyond the shadow of a doubt too. What rational leader would wage chemical war with inspectors there to investigate earlier allegations of chemical warfare in a downtown hotel? And this was one of the things that was hardest for me to wrap my mind around in those early hours of this. Now? He's going to do it now? Whether or not he had control of his commanders, I'm not sure we'll know. But what we haven't gotten is any whisper that there has been a massacre among his senior command ranks. You know, if they were disobeying his orders or his Minister of Defense's orders, then one would expect that some of these commanders would have met their fate very, very quickly. Because this brought a heck of a lot of headache to his doorstep, including the very public threats of use of force. So let's go down in the bottom corner. I have to give credit where it's due. A lot of people complained about the red line. I, as a person who work in the field of chemical disarmament, am very grateful that someone is willing to draw a line somewhere, and if it can't be at the use of weapons of mass destruction, just what are we willing to tolerate? Now, the choice of words might not have been great. It might have not have been necessarily that well thought out, But the notion that the international community will no longer tolerate the use of chemical weapons has a great deal of appeal for me. And given how strongly the evidence was pointing toward Damascus in those very early hours, the fact that the United States brandished military force in order probably to curtail additional rapid use. But once you make that public, you can't really take it back. And in that sense, for me, maybe he started to really earn the Nobel that a lot of people think he might have been prematurely awarded. How about the other principal U.S. player in this equation? I happen to have worked with Kerry when he was a senator, and I worked with him quite closely on the ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention. He knows a great deal about this treaty, and he believes so passionately in the norms behind it that he was willing to go up against the Clinton White House in order to try to preserve the verification integrity of this treaty. There were some things that the White House was willing to accept in its eagerness to get a vote scheduled in the spring of 1997 that really should not have ever been on the table, because if your inspectors can't go in and do their jobs, foreshadowing of things to come, then you're shooting yourself in the foot, even if you are desperate to avoid the embarrassment of a major international treaty coming into force with you not being a member. We can talk about that later if you want to. So this is a guy that got on TV and said something that was very much interpreted as a slip of the tongue. Remember that off-the-cuff remark to a reporter's question? It wasn't. It so was not off the cuff. This guy is really, really intelligent, and he deliberately thinks things through. I've seen him pants people when he needs to, and you don't see it coming. So that was orchestrated. I've also heard it from fairly senior Russian officials, very carefully arranged. Otherwise, why would you see the Russians come out an hour after this supposed slip of the tongue and say, yeah, we think it'd be great if disarmament, chemical disarmament took place. And then, 3 hours later, all of a sudden the same message is coming out of Damascus. No, that was very carefully orchestrated. In fact, there were a series of meetings that took place between both White Houses in the last couple of years. Sometimes the meetings were, hypothetical terms were used. They would discuss a problem where a country in a civil war has a chemical weapons program, and we need to cooperate on how to reduce the threat. How do we do that? So, and sometimes Syria would actually be mentioned by name. So the groundwork for this has been laid over the past couple of years in the specific disarmament taunt that went out over the airwaves. Was, again, no slip of the tongue. So I think these guys were, quite frankly, very immensely relieved that they didn't have to go to war. I don't think anybody in Washington really wanted to go to war. You could see, I'm up on Capitol Hill during this period of time. I'm getting called and for all sorts of background briefings, and there's just like this collective exhale on Capitol Hill. Nobody had to vote because they saw the handwriting on the wall with the British Parliament vote, and the fact that the shadow of 2003 hangs over all of this. I think there's also an eye in Washington toward the broader Middle East picture. That's why I've got that peace, Middle East peace in the middle symbol. At least with the idea that maybe if we pull off what most people think can't be pulled off, then maybe we'll get a running start toward a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, if not a political solution for Syria in the near term. We'll see. Then there's the other guys in this equation, the Russians. Okay, it's pretty clear. They're friends with Syria. They're making a lot of money selling them conventional arms. That's the dirty hand down below. See the money part? That's the conventional part of this equation. The dirty hand, I've already told you about. Moscow has, I believe, something pretty serious to be embarrassed about here. It's not that other governments haven't in prior years fed chemical weapons programs for the United States sold, what was it, 650,000 metric tons of chemical weapons precursors to Iraq. It was against U.S. law, but we didn't police our own law well enough to prevent it at the time. So there wouldn't be the first, there may not be the last, but Moscow's hands are dirty here. And I think that's really part of the motivation for them to push Syria. We'll push Syria, go up. And the thing they may have found out on the 21st of August is that they may not be able to control their man. So let's move a little bit further. Ah, the bumpy road, here it comes. We've seen a couple of signals of the bumpy road. One came out last week. I got a call from Colin Lynch. My God, they've requested to convert their production facilities. I'm going, whoa, really? I thought it might happen if you really had a lot of nerve, but wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't coincide with what I now know from the declaration that has been made public. What this turns out to be, and I got clarification on it this morning, is that they have requested, that's why I've got the number 12, they've requested the conversion basically of 12 empty buildings. The equipment has been destroyed, and the conversion isn't towards something that has a chemical purpose. They're just going to turn it into warehouses. So he kind of got the story half right. But everybody's expecting another shoe to drop, including me. And that shoe dropped this morning, if you were reading the newspapers. And it was dropped by our U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who started griping in public about our concerns about Syria's declaration, backed up by some very conveniently placed, unnamed senior U.S. officials talking about our concerns in a little bit more detail and with less diplomatic nuance. Apparently, we're worried that they didn't declare enough. Stay tuned. So, I've already briefly mentioned the security concerns. Of note here is that security is supposed to be the responsibility of the Syrian government. That's according to the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 2118. The rebels are on record, at least the ones you can find to get to comment about it. There are supposedly 200 different groups fighting in Syria. But the most prominent of them have pledged to not intentionally try to harm the inspectors as they go about their work. That's good. These guys aren't exactly enthusiastic about wearing Kevlar, but they're doing a great job. Again, moving this stuff through transportation corridors. There are security issues, but also safety issues in case things might be leaking. I make no guarantees on what some of these players might do with this tempting of a prize rolling through their midst. We may see it in the days ahead. Oh, the Russians, by the way, made a public statement about augmenting the security for this. Behind the scenes, they're saying, we're really not enthusiastic about putting a lot of boots on the ground, even with their friends. And if we do get called upon to do this, we'd like some company. So they're going to go ask the former Soviet states to provide company for them. Again, one of these many interesting things that are being done along the way to try to accomplish this. So you might have read about what the United States plans to bring into this equation. And this is a field bulk agent destruction capability. You can see some of the specifics. It can process 5 to 25 metric tons a day. What it's doing is either vastly degrading the chemicals or it's using chemicals to degrade chemicals. It may be done with hot water, might be done with sodium hydroxide or sodium hypochlorite, depending upon what is put inside for degrading. There'll be a lot of waste byproduct that comes out of this process. So this has been done for our bulk chemical weapons storage sites at Aberdeen and also Newport, Indiana. But this is probably what's going to get parked in Albania. We'll see. It's not all done. Now, as far as our man Assad, I think it's worth to consider briefly his track record with regard to compliance with his obligations under international nonproliferation treaties. I give you the track record on this slide. Syria was one of the first Arab nations, in fact, like to brag about being one of the first Arab nations to join the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Then at some point they decided, well, we weren't going to abide by that deal. They built a reactor at a location known as al-Kibar. You can see pictures of that reactor underneath this tarp in secret. The Israelis figured that out. They bombed it. And afterwards, when the International Atomic Energy Agency, those are the nuclear watchdogs, the nuclear equivalent of the OPCW, said they wanted to investigate this situation, they went into stall mode. By the way, these two pictures on the bottom show the site before the bombing, after the bombing, when you can very clearly see a nuclear reactor hull, and then what the site looked like just a few days later, because they took every scrap of metal, brick, whatever was left, and hauled it off, like within 4 days. That's a determined effort to cover up evidence, I'd say. And when the inspectors did finally arrive, they confined their activities walking around this site. But the inspectors still were able to take samples that showed man-made uranium. What did the Syrians say to that? Not us. We didn't enrich anything. It must be the residues of those Israeli bombs that unjustifiably hit this site. Syria has refused the IAEA entry to 2 other sites that may be associated with the covert nuclear weapons program, and they've never let them back at al-Kibar. I think that track record speaks for itself, and that's before, again, our investigators led by Åke Sällström arrived in Damascus. Syria, this is the kind of games that are played. This is the stuff I describe in Germ Gambits. Syria requested the investigation of those earlier incidents. These are the ones who sent the letter to Ban Ki-moon before the rebels did. Please come investigate. We have nothing to hide. Then for several months, that happened in mid-March, the inspectors didn't land in Damascus because Syria said, we can't guarantee your security. This is just impossible, blah, blah, blah. In other words, delay, delay, delay. They didn't land in Damascus until 3 days before August the 21st. And then what happens? Well, immediately after the attacks, if you'll remember, the Assad government bombed the heck out of the attack locations, trying to hide all the evidence they could. And then they held the inspectors in the hotel for 5 days. The first day that they left the hotel, they ended up going to do interviews and collect evidence at a hospital where a lot of the victims were. What happened? Oh, snipers, you say? They shot at them. Come on. Again, straight out of the Saddam Hussein playbook. See that image up top? These are a couple of United Nations Special Commission inspectors and IAEA inspectors standing on top of a Calyatron. At one point, when the inspectors were hot on the trail of Saddam's nuclear weapons program, in the late summer, early fall of 1991, they knocked on the front door of a facility. The Iraqis said, what do you want with us? Well, out the back door flew the Calyutrons. An inspector had climbed a water tower and happened to be able to see this. They gave chase. The Iraqis fired at them, but they got it on video. The Iraqis didn't declare nearly all that they had. Their opening biological declaration was, we don't have anything. In fact, we don't have any, it wasn't any just a military declaration, no military declaration. We don't have anything biological in our whole country, which defies credulity on its face. And their facility, by the way, at al-Hakam, which because we didn't know about it, we didn't talk about it publicly, they thought we knew, and they declared it. And that al-Hakam facility looked exactly like Methana, which was the home of Iraq's chemical weapons program. So again, this is about whether or not we do the right things to get them to make a full declaration, which is the basis on which everything proceeds. Oh, there's Muammar Gaddafi's stash. He held some back. He didn't make a full declaration either. Remember, the interim government in Tripoli, after Gaddafi was killed, made this little announcement saying, oh, he kept some. So these are the types of things that I'm kind of anticipating given the behavior already exhibited by Bashar al-Assad. The Obama administration doesn't like me saying this, by the way. But it's not my job to tell you what you want to hear. This is going to be easy. It's my job to tell you what we should be learning from history, including the history of Syria with regard to this stuff. Now, how's this going to play out? A couple more words and then I'll quit. Because there are a lot of people who haven't read the verification annex of the Chemical Weapons Convention and think that right now the inspectors are really equipped to go in and even to do challenge inspections. And the Chemical Weapons Convention, as remarkable of a document as it is, it has challenge inspections in it. But it also gives Syria, because it's now a full member of the treaty, rights to manage the amount of access that the inspectors get during routine and challenge inspections. And that could be problematic. We may have to go back to the Security Council to strip those rights from Assad in the days ahead. I don't know. Look, any progress made in disarming Syria chemically is going to be a victory. What I'm worried about is this becoming a Pyrrhic victory, one where he holds stuff back. Our intelligence was incomplete. We didn't know how much he had, and the inspectors can't get at it under these circumstances, particularly under these circumstances. UNSCOM really did have unimpeded rights. There are still people out there who think that the report that was filed from the attacks of the 21st doesn't convincingly say that the Assad government is responsible for that. Principal among those, Russia. So sometimes even in the face of a lot of evidence, politics will hold sway. So I have genuine concerns about what will unfold, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
We would like to open up for questions, and at least for the first round of questions, any students who have questions, please feel free, and she will field as many as you have.
So you said that all of the leaders, from your examples, they hadn't declared any chemical weapons, or they only declared as much as they thought that the US knew, or the UN knew. So what is the incentive for these leaders to declare these weapons?
What is his current incentive to come clean?
Right, I mean, obviously the UN wants him to declare as much as possible, but if we're looking from his point of view, Assad's point of view, what is his incentive?
Well, given the fact that this initial statement of concern about the declaration came from such a high U.S. official, in the venue in which it came, read the tea leaves here with me. If we'd wanted to not nudge Moscow, it would have just come out of some unnamed source in Washington. Some unnamed senior official. This came with a very big name attached to it. That signal not only went straight to Moscow, yo, better bring your fella in line here, and it raises for everybody the specter, including Assad, the specter that a U.S. military strike might go back on the table here. Now, since we're under the auspices of the Chemical Weapons Convention, I would expect several additional moves to go forward. And there's a way to allow Assad to save face. Putting together a declaration like this is not an easy thing to do. And he can always do what we had to do under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and say, oops, we made a mistake. We forgot to declare this. We actually forgot to declare our static missile, so it wasn't a big deal, like this could be. But it depends on what Assad's exit strategy is. Is it to go to The Hague? Is this guy really thinking he's going to remain in power? Will he run for re-election? Or is he thinking he's going to go out in a blaze of glory and take as many people with him as he can? So it may not be the best incentive, but it's the right move for the U.S. government make at this stage of the game.
Thanks for your talk. My question is just about, you mentioned a few times the analogy with, or the potential analogy with Saddam Hussein. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the problems, or I guess one of the difficulties with that, is that Saddam was sort of playing a two-level game. So on the one hand, he feared the international community making sanctions if he had weapons of mass destruction. On the other hand, he feared his own people if he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Do you think, I mean, that you mentioned you don't think he's rational. Might it be that he fears, that he thinks the threat of an international intervention is less than the threat of, the rebels, and he's more concerned with striking fear into their hearts?
When I thought about why do what he did on the 21st, step back, what better way to demoralize your opponent than to kill their families in their sleep? That's hard. A lot of atrocities have occurred during the course of this war that are all conventional warfare atrocities. The number of chemical casualties as opposed to the 100,000 plus. You can't compare this stuff. But I actually think both of those factors, it is a correct analogy, because he's been at war now for more than 2 years, trying to hold on to power. So he obviously has concerns about his own civilians not liking him so much. And he's obviously got very few allies left. He's down to Moscow, Iran, North Korea. That's not a big fan club. And he's also got increasingly vocal opponents within the region. I remember very early on when the Arab League stripped him of membership, I went, this is getting interesting. And that was before the war got ugly. Really, really ugly. Now, Saudi Arabia has declined a UN Security Council seat. You think the Saudis aren't serious about this? You think they're not getting the Gulf states together to figure out if the West is not going to put military resources into this equation of their own or provide significant financial assistance to the rebels, how they aren't going to really up their bankroll? He's got worries everywhere he looks, if he's looking. Again, sometimes you're delusional. I think he totally underestimated the inspectors.
Your interpretation seems to flatter our think tanks and policymakers. Everything is planned and organized and prearranged. Watching that speech Obama gave where he says the red line, watching Kerry's speech where he says they're not going to do this, indicates to me some level of either spontaneity or happenstance or luck. I also look at the Russians and wonder what their motivation really was. And again, you say this was all arranged between Russia and Syria, and they figured all this out, and 1 hour later, Russia says this, and 3 hours later, Syria says that. But I wonder if Putin of late hasn't been feeling cast aside by the world community, not playing any sort of serious role in diplomacy or world affairs, and that this was a way for him to hurl himself onto the world scene and be able to come forward with a proposal. And my goodness, people seem to be taking it seriously and moving ahead with it. And all of a sudden, Russia's a player again. So I wonder if you would comment on any of that.
Thanks for the question. The only flattery intended was to flatter the man who stood up for the norm against using chemical weapons and possessing us. There's a big difference now between 1988, when Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds at Halabja, in 2013. This is human progress. Sometimes it comes in fits and starts. That's the flattery I intended again. I actually think the red line statement was somewhat off the cuff. That's why I made the comment of maybe it wasn't the best choice of words. And what was orchestrated with Kerry was between Washington and Moscow. I don't know whether or not that orchestration went all the way to Damascus once there was an agreement behind the scenes that let's take one last stab here. And that was done at the G8 summit for the most part. In addition to that series of meetings, 4 or 5 meetings that the NSCs, the National Security Councils, had behind the scenes, laying the groundwork for us to be able to approach the Russians and say, now's your time. So that was the orchestration. I wouldn't be surprised, given what I understand to have been the level of Russian push toward Damascus, that orchestration did not go all the way there. And probably was met with a middle finger salute. Because it's clear this guy went to a lot of trouble to get this stuff. He'd like to use more of it. Why give up one of your military advantages when you think you might not be able to hold on to power? So I think that Syria was painted into a corner, drug kicking and screaming to this point. And heaven forbid I flatter Washington think tanks or most Washington politicians. That was unintended. The other flattery that is deserved, by the way, is the Nobel to the OPCW. There were a lot of people who were disappointed Malala didn't get it. And again, that was another one of those situations where I'm up at the crack of dawn because I'm getting called for comment on this. I'm going like, yeah, I'm a big Malala fan too. But these guys have been toiling in the trenches to make peace here for a long time, and now they're really putting their lives on the line in an unprecedented set of circumstances. Yes, they deserve it. So that would be the other flattery I'd pass out.
Hi, I actually had 2 questions. How sophisticated are the weapons that we've recovered and disabled so far? And if they came from Russia, do you think that Russia sold these weapons before acceding to the CWC?
I can't speak specifically to the sale, but the handwriting was on the wall for the Chemical Weapons Convention. In fact, Russia and the United States had concluded a bilateral destruction agreement that was meant to lead the international disarmament process in chemical weapons. I think in 1992, I think Russia ended up ratifying a bit after us. I remember going to Moscow to work that process. That was fun. But I can't speak exactly to when the sales took place and whether or not they were direct Moscow to Damascus. Look, more details about this will hopefully come in the months ahead. The OPCW typically does not make much of anything public, but I've talked with my sources there and said, look, I'll buy the round. In fact, I'll buy plenty of rounds for the first inspector who comes back with Cyrillic on production equipment, okay? Because they're taking pictures, they're documenting, but saving face and getting as much done as possible will probably override any public revelation of this type of detail. Because we've got to keep Russia constructively involved in this process before we take our pound of flesh, if it is ever taken over the role that Russia had in Syria's chemical weapons program. So at present, I don't know. In the systems, you saw some of the pictures. I can provide you with more. There are many images that are available both in the report as well as elsewhere. But it's missile warheads, Scud missiles. A lot of things came from North Korea, but a lot probably came from Russia too.
We have time for perhaps 2 more questions.
I'm wondering what you think of Russia's decision calculus moving forward. Now that, since you mentioned they pretty clearly worked with us and maybe the Syrian regime on a deal, but at this point, the longer Syria drags this out, the more Russia is able to maintain its influence in the Middle East and on the world stage. So I'm wondering if you think, which one do you think will win out? Will they be a constructive partner moving forward? Or will they just keep kind of like Iran trying to maximize their own influence?
One of the reasons why I did that slide with the triangle is I think every player in this is in a bit of a difficult spot. The United States really doesn't want to go to war. Just look at the public opinion polls. Moscow does want to be the leader you say they want to be. Obviously, they'll get a lot of press from the Sochi Olympics, but what can we do before then? And this was the opportunity that knocked at their door. And they're walking a line between fueling a conventional war while taking the high ground on weapons of mass destruction. It's an interesting thing they're attempting to do, particularly since I really don't think they've got full control of their puppet. So I think that there were really uncomfortable hours in Moscow today after what Samantha Power said. Because now they've got to wonder. One of the things that happened in Geneva that I've also put a question mark about is that there was apparently an intelligence exchange. And this is now on the public record, that the United States and Russia, one of the meetings, they have all these little working groups that take place, and one of the meetings was an intelligence exchange. But detail about how that occurred has yet to emerge, and I've dug. But they're keeping their mouths shut in Washington to this point. And it may be because instead of having both sides write down on a piece of paper their evaluation of what Syria had in terms of chemical weapons capability, number of sites, types of weapons, blah, 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 and passing it across the table. Instead, you ended up in a situation where a U.S. official is saying, well, our estimate is they have 45 sites. Duh. We think they've got 1,000 metric tons of bulk chemical agent and precursor. Duh. That's not an intelligence exchange. That's a confirmation of the U.S. estimate. So whether or not Russia has put all of its equities into this, I don't know. I do know that there are people in Washington who are very worried about the extent of their commitment. And I did say that they're already backing away from that public pledge. They don't want to put boots on the ground with regard to security. Not that I can blame them. And they certainly don't want stuff coming back to Moscow. I was all for the return to sender program. If you're going to bait someone, you have to do it in a very clever manner. What I just described was not clever baiting, because it gives Russia every opportunity to sandbag. You ask them to write what they know on a piece of paper and slip it across the table, not to give them room to dance and duck. And if the latter happened, then that was not a genuine intelligence exchange. I don't know. But given that I can't get U.S. officials to confirm exactly how that occurred, and knowing, quite frankly, the political pressures in Washington not to go to war, think about the context. Use your common sense.
I have quite a few questions, but some of them will wait till dinner. But you haven't spoken at all about possible biological capability in Syria. And I know that that's not really the subject of your talk today, but certainly a lot of these countries where we found chemical weapons, they're also biological programs too. So do you care to speak at all about that? About what we may know, what the level of intelligence may be that we've shared, or what the state of that is?
May we take this subject up over dinner?
Okay.
See that camera? Even if I've already said this can't go on the internet, But I appreciate the question. It's a good one.
Hi. How much of an underestimation do you think 1,000 metric tons is for bulk agent? Because with 45 plants to produce chemical weapons and with over 2 years to ramp up a chemical weapons program, that seems very insignificant from my limited experience.
That's a lot of production facilities. 18 production facilities. Look at the detail underneath the top two numbers. That's a fair number of production facilities. When we were churning out this stuff left, right, and center, we didn't have much more than that. We made 32,000 metric tons of it. The Russians, I think, only had 4 or 5 major production sites. They were building a Novichok, a dedicated Novichok production site, at the point at which the cover was yanked off of that program by Bill Mirziano. So, I used to have code word clearances. I haven't had that for a long time. I can tell you that this general size of that is in line with some other chemical weapons programs that were declared. You know, the Albanians and the Indians had about that much. The United States and the Soviet Union built a heck of a lot of this stuff because it was anticipated that it would be used on a European battlefield, like Europeans, as part of a ladder of escalation. If somebody broke through, whoever broke through the Fulda Gap was going to get gassed. And that was meant to be the warning shot that we got worse to throw at you. At that time, we didn't really know how much the Soviets had in the biological arena. Thank goodness none of this never unfolded. But the size of the Soviet arsenal and the US arsenal here, just prodigious. And again, we can have a biological discussion about the Soviet bioweapons program, which still to this day, even though I've been in a number of those facilities, I have a hard time grappling that anyone would do that. I've got a shadow over that number for a reason, and over that number for a reason. And I don't think they're telling the truth about field munitions either. One big question mark for me right now.
Thank you very much.